Well, my. Here's Big Daddy Dane back. Deidre says she loves it when I refer to myself in the third person. Says it makes me sound sexy. She doesn't say that at all. She actually hates when I refer to myself in the third person, which means for going on 36 years, 37 years, I've been referring to myself in the third person every time I get a chance. You know, it just keeps things interesting around here. Anyway, I got out of bed this morning with a lot of ambition and initiative and drive. I was ready to set the world on fire. For a man my age and my BMI, that takes a lot. Doesn't happen very often. Mistake I made was I pulled my phone out. You know, I'm not on social media just to be social, just to occupy my day, just to make friends and influence people. No, it's to influence people, but it's not just to make friends, you know. I have business I do on Facebook, not just content creation. I also have business I do that feeds in clientele to my actual real job business, you know. So I have to check social media, you know, periodically anyway. So I pulled it open and that was that. There was a post on my feed from a fella. I don't have any idea who he is, but it popped up. It was interesting. So I said, well, I'm going to go take a look at it. I'm going to go take a look at this thing. I guess that he has a mutual friend, and that mutual friend must have commented on this particular post, because this is the post right here, because it popped up on my, I think that James A. Raymond there, I think that's the same guy as somebody. You know, you can see him there you can see him there. Here, I'll zoom it up a little bit. You see that James A. Raymond? Yeah, I see the little round picture again. Well, duh, you see there? That sounds like the typical comment that comes from him. You know, he's probably a nice guy, but James just ain't very smart, if you know what I mean. So because he commented that, it popped up on my feed, and I'm like, who is this guy? You know, I had some suspicions about the picture. Let me pop over here and show you, because I know if you have eyes as old as mine, it's kind of difficult to read that text on your phone. So lucky for you, Big Daddy is looking out for you. I don't want you getting them ocular migraines now. Come on now, okay. So Marvin Dunn here, white men on horseback. See, that's in all caps. And everybody knows that if something's in all caps, that means they're being very emphatic. They're adding emphasis to let you know that they are very emotionally passionate about it. White men on horseback. White men on horseback has always been a problem for black folks. So this is a post he's making about black folks. Looking through his page, he posts a whole bunch about what he calls black history. Now, me personally, and anybody who knows me or been around me when the subject comes up, I am of the mindset that there is no such thing as black history. No one gets to have their own history. That's an idea born, bred, and birthed out of the feminine mindset that everybody's individual and everybody's special and they can have they can have it their way. You see, that comes from the original lie in Genesis in the Bible, where Satan told the woman, if you eat of this fruit, you can be like God. God is the only unique original entity in the cosmos. You see, the Lord, your hero Israel, the Lord your God is one. Ain't but one God, ain't never going to be but one God. Ain't never been but one God. But the devil convinced the woman that if she would just do such and such and such and such, in that case, eat the fruit, then she could be like God, you know, and part of that would be that she could be original, unique, special. But wouldn't nobody be in the whole cosmos just like her. You know, they teach that to children. There's no one else on this planet just like you. You're so unique. But it's a lie. It's a lie. Liar, liar, dress on fire, okay? You don't get your own history. You don't get your own truth. You don't get your own language. You get the same history and language and truth and reality that everyone else on the planet gets. Well, I guess when it comes to language, people speak different languages, but if you speak English, you don't get your own English. If you speak Spanish, you don't get your own Spanish, right? You don't get your own Dutch. You don't get your own Japanese. White men on horseback has always been a problem for black folks. It was a sign of power and authority. Enslaved men were not allowed to own horses as a rule on most plantations. After all, horses could run. I don't know if enslaved men were allowed to own horses or not. Don't really care because it doesn't have anything to do with my point. But it would make sense that everything like livestock and equipment and stuff on a plantation would belong to the plantation owner. And it would make sense that us enslaved men would not have the funds to buy their own horse. And it would not make any sense for an escaping slave to take a horse with him. Now, I know on the surface, because the feminine mind does not consider logistics. The feminine mind is just going to consider like the spontaneous, impulsive, surface level plan, if you want to call it a plan, for anything. This is why there's not a building on the planet that's been built exclusively by women. Women, by and large, in the words of Brother Jesse Lee Peterson, not all, but most women lack the ability to develop long-term, deep, structured plans to accomplish a task. They usually would just come up with a couple of steps and they go at it. And that's why, like I said, there's never been a building on this planet exclusively built by women. Okay, so it would make sense if you're planning on escaping from a plantation. It would make sense for the slave to leave by himself and not on a horse. Now, I know the feminine mind would say, no, he could get on that horse and he'd be able to cover more ground faster and everything than he could walking by himself. And so that's how women end up in relationship after relationship with men who abuse them. Because that's as far as they go into thinking. I mean, many women make business and relationship and life decisions based on the zodiac. 80% of every dollar in this country, the spending decision is made by women. And so marketers and advertisers convince women to pay $200 to buy jeans that have holes in them just by telling these women that those jeans make their butt look good. See? So that, because horses could run, would make sense to a feminine thinking person. Now, I don't mean an effeminate, as in LBGT, flamboyance. I don't mean that. I mean to a person who thinks and reasons on the feminine end of the spectrum, rather. See, as a rule on most plantations, after all, horses could run. That runaway slave would not want to take that horse, or probably it wouldn't be a good idea, shouldn't take the horse because of this. Horses have to be fed. Horses have to be maintained. Horses make noise. Runaway slaves typically made progress in their flight at night, where it was easier for them to move around stealthily. So during the day, they had to have somewhere to hide out and conceal and be quiet. And that would be very, very hard to do with a damn animal with you, especially one the size of a horse. So typically, the slave would not take a horse with him. So that calls this post into question right there. But the point I want to make out is that this post is formatted by him in such a way to create a delineation and set up like a hostility almost between white men on horseback has always been a problem for black folks. Reality is white men on horseback can be a problem for any folks, black or white. depending on what the situation is. But he has established the conflict of white men on horseback somehow or another being a problem for black folks. So he's established this struggle between black and white, okay? And he's established that his post is about enslaved men in this context, right? Okay, moving on. So I said, well, who is this guy? So I like to know a little something about these guys before I go and, just make posts about them and move on, Marvin Dunn says right there, University of Tennessee, Knoxville. So that tells me, because there's a little graduation cap beside it, that must be his alma mater. Maybe, maybe not. It may be his place of employment. You'll notice right there in his profile picture, there's a picture of the cover of his book, Florida Through Black Eyes. I assume he means the eyes of black people and not the eyes of somebody that's got the hands laid on him and gave black eyes to him. He lives in Miami. He's married. He looks like he either ran for Congress or was planning on running for Congress, because the website link he has there is Dr. Marvin Dunn for Congress.com. I clicked on the link. This is just a screenshot, or I click on it for you right now, but I clicked on the link and it took me to a page not found. So I don't know if he abandoned that idea, never developed his website, or whether or not he ran for Congress, lost, took the website down. Don't know. Doesn't have anything to do with my point either. Right down there, work, retired, chairperson. Wow, impressive. Of the Department of Psychology. So perhaps he was the chairperson of the Department of Psychology at the University of Knoxville, Tennessee. I don't know. Maybe he retired to Miami after he retired, or maybe he was the chairperson at the University of Miami or some other school in that area. Don't know. But what I'm establishing here is that we're not dealing with the average Joe who's just posting stuff on Facebook. This guy, looking through his page, there's no reason for me to disbelieve what he's claiming here about being a PhD and that sort of thing. And if he's a PhD, then I would think he would have been trained in his education to be very thorough in his research before he releases any sort of a conclusion or any sort of statement. That's all part of being educated. I have this argument with people all the time who want to disparage higher education. They say, well, it's so expensive, and there are pipe fitters out there making six figures, and there are people with master's degrees who are waiting tables and working at Walmart. So higher education is a scam. You don't need it. No, you need it. The value of an education cannot be measured according to the salary you're going to make, because higher education prepares you to think critically, like I'm doing right now, when you come across stuff like Dr. Dunn has shared on his Facebook in his efforts to advance his agenda of spreading black history and all of the race sort of machinations that flow from that. So this is Dr. Dunn. This is who Dr. Dunn is. And you see over here, you could zoom in if you want to, I guess, on your phone and see that none of his commenters there, at least in that screenshot, are taking any. They're not challenging him with that at all. So I thought, because, AI is really messing things up. I'm a firm believer that before very long, artificial intelligence is going to have corrupted the historical record, because these AI pictures and AI videos have gotten so common that the Gen Zers and the Gen Alphas have coined this phrase AI slop, because it's a bunch of junk. But actually, we're living in the only era, I believe we're in the only era, where we're going to be able to tell the difference in authentic photographs and videos and such, and artificial intelligence generated photographs and videos and such. Because you can still tell what's fake and what's real. But as AI progresses and gets better and better, it's not going to be very long before we're not going to be able to tell. And at that point, we're not going to be able to tell reality from artificial intelligence. Imagine what that's going to do to people's psyches. As my mama would say, I shudder to think. I shudder to think. But anyway, my presumption when I first saw the picture, because of it, there was just something off about the resolution and the way it looked. I thought, well, this is some of that artificial intelligence stuff, right? So I just took the picture and did what any Alabama redneck can do, and certainly a PhD in psychology could have done. And I went and I just dropped it off in Google image search. I mean, we're not talking about, EBSCO or anything, just dropped it off in Google, and it popped up some pictures. And the first picture it popped up was the one you see here on the right. But it looks a lot like the first picture, but you'll notice the man on the horse is missing, and the people are moved around a little bit. So that kind of encouraged me that I was on the scent. I was on the right scent, and that I was actually correct that this was an AI image. I'm feeling really good about myself. I said, man, I'm a pretty fart smeller. That moment of exuberant hubris didn't last long. It didn't last long. So check this out. Here's the picture. This is the exact cropped picture that Dr. Dunn shared on his Facebook post. And so I'm going to take this exact picture and I'm going to slide it up here, and you'll see that this picture fits in perfectly right there. It just fits right in there. You can't even really tell that that's two pictures on top of each other. It fits in so well. So that let me know right there that the picture Dr. Dunn posted is actually a cropped picture and then enlarged of a larger picture. I said, oh, well, that would explain why the pixels and such of the photograph look kind of odd. Maybe it's not AI, but it could be a cropped portion of an AI. I mean, who knows nowadays, right? Stuff be wild online sometime, right? On the internet. So I got to doing some more research, digging around, and I found a picture on the right. I'd already found a picture on the right. And so I got to looking at it. Said, Because unlike most people, seemingly Dr. Dunn, at least in this situation, I'm going to extend to him the benefit of the doubt that this was just an oversight or a mistake, But most people, when they come across something like this in their life, they don't say, let me research what I think with the goal be to disprove what I think. They don't do that. What they do is they have an idea that pops in their head, or really a claim and a thought in their head that something is the case. And then they go about research, which is usually just some internet searches, to find supporting evidence for what they already believe is true. And when they find that supporting evidence for what they already believe is true, then they just roll with it. And that's true. They'll be wrong, but they'll be convinced that they're true. I don't do that. When I've arrived at a conclusion, or I'm pretty close to a conclusion, I go and I try to find alternative explanations for what my claim is. And I try to find ways to disprove what my claim is. That's what I do because before I start telling people things publicly, I want to have done everything I could to prove myself wrong. Because I want to make sure that what I tell people is the honest truth, the best I know it. It doesn't mean that everything I say is true. It means that by the time I say it, I have bent over backwards and tied myself into knots trying to prove that it is not true That's called a falsification. I'm trying to falsify my own claim. And when I feel like I've reached a sufficient level and have not been able to falsify it, well, then I will, I will accept it and I'll state it publicly. And I'll hang on to that until someone comes along who can falsify it, which never happens. Never happens. Why does it never happen? Because I'm a pretty fart smeller. That's why I am. That's who I am. That's Big Daddy. So I got to looking, and in that vein, I'm thinking to myself, is there an alternative, explanation for this other than someone took the picture on the right? Because you looked at the bottom, it says Cotton is King Plantations, seen Florida, USA. As it turns out, it's not Florida. That's just a mistake. But so that's a collection, looks like. So did someone take a picture from the collection and edit in the guy on horseback? I mean, that's a possibility. So I dug around, and that's not the case. What I'm convinced this is two pictures taken in succession. The guy, the photographer, and remember, in this day and age, photographs took a long time to expose the medium to take the photograph. It's not like nowadays where you go click and, click, like that, where you can have thousands of photographs on your cell phone. Now, this guy, the camera was a very manual machine. He had to set his exposure time, his f-stops, all of that sort of stuff. Click, and then he had to pull this big thing out of it. It looked almost like an x-ray machine today. When the x-ray tech comes over there and slides a cartridge into the thing, almost like that. Get everything re-prepared and stuff, and then take another picture. So what I believe has happened is he took the first picture on the left. The horse kept walking as he was, preparing his camera to take another picture. The guy carrying the bale of cotton kept walking. People kept working. The little girl on the picture on the left is to the right of the basket. Photographer took the picture. And notice how much cotton there is between the little girl and the adult, looks like adult, possibly teenager, but older person behind her. There's a lot of cotton on those bushes. He took the picture. The little girl kept working, picking cotton. The lady behind her kept working, picking cotton and everything. And then he took the second picture. And by the time he took the second picture, the man on the horse was gone. The little girl was to the left of the basket instead, and the lady behind her had worked her way over to the right-hand side of the basket. So that convinced me that the picture posted by Dr. Dunn was an authentic picture, because all of this relies on both of these pictures being authentic. So I said, okay, so that was good. I got that one figured out. Now let me see here. Okay. So then there was the text at the bottom of the right-hand picture. Cotton is King Plantation, seen Florida, USA. So I said, well, let me find out a little bit more about, because that sounds like the name of a collection. Cotton is King or whatever. So maybe I can research some stuff about these pictures. Did they come out of a book? Newspaper article, what is it? So I got to looking, and this is what I found. And I know, you'd rather keep looking at Big Daddy's pretty face, right? You would. I know you would. But I want you to be able to see what's on this screenshot of the website. So this is from the Digital Library of Georgia. Okay. Cotton is King Plantation Scene, Georgia, USA, 1896. By hard name number one in Wyman, hardweight name number one in Wyman Publishers. New York, isn't everything they say. It's nothing. Anyway, sold only by Underwood and Underwood, New York, London, Toronto, Canada, Ottawa, and Kansas. You see that date? See that date up there? I got the arrows pointing at it. That date, 1896. I got it down there. The original was taken in 1895. And the description down here, I'm going to have to zoom this in a little bit. By God, let me see here. Let me zoom this on in here. You can really read it. Rural Georgia, circa 1895. Stereo view titled Cotton is King, Plantation Scene, Georgia, USA. Depicted are a group of blacks in a field picking cotton. Rural Georgia. This is an albumin print. You know, I used to know what an albumin print was, what the difference was, but I don't anymore. You know, I used to know, but I've gotten old and I've forgotten. But anyway, it's just an old photograph. 1895 was when the picture was taken, and then it was published the following year. What's significant about that? 1895, let me get that website picture off so you can see my pretty face, see my pretty blue eyes. Yeah, got my new hat too, got my new hat in today. I'm happy about that. 1895 was 30 years, exactly 30 years after the end of slavery, which was at the end of the Civil War. So this picture doesn't matter. I know it's going to be really tempting for people to make a logical fallacy and appeal to authority, that fallacious appeal to authority, and say, well, Dr. Dunn's a PhD, and I think I'm going to take the word of a PhD before I take the word of some fat, gray-bearded, backwoods Alabama redneck. Well, you're free to do that. But sometimes PhD stands for posthole digger. But even when they don't, even when the PhD is actually a very qualified master of his field, they still make mistakes. And I'm being as charitable as I can here, that Dr. Dunn simply had an oversight, made a mistake, and not that he was being nefariously, motivated here and intentionally misrepresented the case. So I'm going to be very charitable and just say he made a mistake. But the picture, there's no reason to believe that the people in these pictures were slaves. Not in 1895. The reality is the people in this picture were sharecroppers. Now, some people would say, well, yeah, Dane, but sharecropping was the same thing. Well, not exactly. Sharecropping was a system where sharecroppers would essentially rent the land, and sometimes they would rent the equipment and the seed and the fertilizer, and they would do all of this in exchange for a portion of the crops when the crops came in. This is why they would do this. And then what would happen oftentimes is the debt to the landowner would exceed the money that came in from the harvest. And so sharecropping ended up not chattel slavery, like Dr. Dunn implies in his post. Enslaved men were not allowed to own horses. Sharecroppers could own whatever they could afford to buy, horses or otherwise. Why? They were not enslaved. Although sharecropping, an argument could be made that because of the debt, that sharecropping was a sort of debt slavery, right? That argument could be made. So one could still argue, well, dang, sharecropping was just a replacement, that instead of chattel slavery, that the sharecroppers were enslaved by the debt. And so it was still black folks being managed by that man on the horse. And that man on the horse was still a sign of power and authority over the black people. So sharecropping was just another name for slavery. So, Dane, you have a moot point. I was debating a guy on a panel a couple nights ago, and he referred to a mute point, mute, M-U-T-E. I couldn't speak. A mute point. No, it's a moot point, moot, M-O-O-T, meaning that it's irrelevant to the conversation. So, but some would argue, yeah, but sharecropping was still a black history thing, and so it's kind of the same thing. But au contraire, mon frere. Here we are at the History Channel.com, the History Channel, and I bring up the History Channel like this because I tried to find a more academic source, and I was in a hurry. Because like I said, I got out of bed this morning very driven, ready to go. And I ran up on this, so I wanted to hurry up and put this together. So, history.com, there's a whole page here. You can go look it up here. I'll scroll up here. Maybe it'll pop up the website. Yeah, here's the title, Sharecropping. It goes through here explaining everything about General Sherman's 40 acres and a mule thing. And then after 3 months after that, Congress and state legislatures returned confiscated federal lands to the landowners, which left the black people at that time that had received the 40 acres in the land in Georgia. It left them farming land that had reverted back to the landowner, which was the very beginnings of sharecropping. Talks here about black codes, which were codes that the South put in place that ended up creating crimes for the freed slaves to be guilty of so that they could be imprisoned. And then those prisoners, because the Constitution with the 13th Amendment said that, people couldn't be held in slavery, but it gives a caveat for incarcerated people, which is why one of the big reasons we have a high school to prison pipeline right now, you see. But so the black codes, loitering, for instance, was something that would get you arrested and put in jail and put back, out on the plantation, loitering, hanging out down the street, doing the same thing we did last week. Remember, just hanging out, not going anywhere, just taking up space. They'd arrest you for loitering. Imagine that. It's a crime to stand around, do nothing. They'd arrest you for loitering, put you in jail, and then one of the farmers would come, basically post your bail, and then take you, and you'd have to pick his cotton. So that's what this right here is talking about, the black codes, and then it brings you on up here, and then the rise of the sharecropping system. Let's read through that real quick, shall we? Despite giving black Americans the rights of citizens, the federal government and the Republican-controlled state government formed during this phase of Reconstruction took little concrete action to help free black people in their quest to own their own land. Instead of receiving wages for working an owner's land and having to submit to supervision and harsh discipline, most poor farm laborers preferred to rent land for a fixed payment. By the early 1870s, let's hop back over here because I said by the early 1870s. So let's look right here. What does that say? 1896. So by 20 years before this picture was taken, which was the 1870s, by the early 1870s, the system known as sharecropping had come to dominate agriculture across the South. Under this system, families would rent small plots of land or shares to work themselves in return. In return, they would give a portion of their crop to the landowner at the end of the harvest system. Here's the important part I want you to pay attention to. The system was used by white families as well as blacks. The majority. What portion? The majority of U.S. sharecroppers, about 2/3, that's about 66% of sharecroppers, were white folks. And in many areas of rural South, only about 1/4 of white people owned land. Who are these white people on horses he's talking about in 1896 that were riding around on horses to intimidate enslaved people, which didn't exist 30 years after the passage of the 13th Amendment? Who were these white men on horses that he's telling people on his Facebook page was used to intimidate and control enslaved people in 1896? It's a picture of sharecroppers. That's what it is. It's not a picture of, that picture had zilch to do with enslaved people. It's a picture of sharecroppers. And yet, there were a lot of black sharecroppers, many of them former slaves. How many of them? 33% of the sharecroppers were black. And in popular culture today, sharecropping is used as an example of how chattel slavery before the end of the Civil War, before abolition of slavery, it merely converted over and changed its name into the sharecropping system, but it was still slavery. But while there were similarities, but there are similarities in the debt slavery of sharecropping and the debt slavery of student loans in 2026, if we want to talk about that argument. But there were similarities. The sharecropper in debt could not legally abandon his debt. I mean, he could be beaten, suffer other violence. He could be thrown into debtor's prison. All sorts of things there were consequences if he broke his sharecropping contract. While this is true, he was not an enslaved man. He was not banned from owning horses. He didn't have to run away from the plantation necessarily, unless he was going to abandon his debt, which many people did. But the sharecropping system, which is what Dr. Dunn puts his picture up of, are sharecroppers. Sharecropping system affected twice as many people, twice as many white people as it did black people. The sharecropping system, truth matters in history. Truth matters in anything. The sharecropping system was absolutely not a black history. And again, I don't even think black history exists. I don't think white history exists. I don't think necessarily American history exists. There's just history. You don't get your own history. But sharecropping was not a black thing. That's what popular culture establishes it at. As if white people didn't suffer under the same debt slavery system side by side. But men like Dr. Dunn will use things like this and will give just enough facts. And some of those, they're going to be misrepresented in order to posit black people and posit white people as if there is some sort of an ancient and necessary historical tension between the two of them. And they do this in order to keep those two groups at one another's throats. This is a perfect example of that. At least from everything I look at it is. Because if Dr. Dunn were to post up on his Facebook page, instead of post it, say, look at how bad it was for us black folks, look at how bad these white men were treating us. If he post up on his Facebook and said, you know what, in 1896, life was hell for everybody, earning a living to feed yourself, take care of your family was hell for everybody because there were no social safety nets. There was no educational assistance. No, you either got it up out of the dirt or you didn't get it up out of the dirt. So out on those plantations, there were 2 white people slaving away picking that cotton for every 1 black person. Because most black people, that article from history.com, remember, said fewer than 25% of white people in the rural South, which was almost the whole South, less than 25% of them even owned land. So people want to focus on how black people didn't get their 40 acres and a mule and how hard it was for black people to own land. Well, God dog it, 75% of the white folks in the South didn't own land. Blacks and whites were having to rent land or live out in a ditch somewhere. So I fail to see how that situation is somehow another a strictly black history issue, which is, again, why I don't believe black history actually exists. It's just history. We were all poor down here. I know my people were. You see this plaid? I'm Scotch-Irish. The Scotch-Irish were the primary 66% that was out there picking cotton right along beside the slaves and then right along beside the black sharecroppers post-Civil War. Look into a man named Alfred Carr, C-A-R-R. He is the actor Morgan Freeman's great-great-great-grandfather. And he was a Scotch-Irishman, Kosciuszko, Mississippi. And he lived on a plantation. He was hired labor. The only difference in him and the slaves was he had more freedom of travel. He couldn't be, beaten, killed, whatever. That's the only difference. And he had a girlfriend on the plantation named Celie Johnson. Celie Johnson. Ain't that, doesn't that sound poetic? Miss Celie. And they had children together on the plantation. I know that the culture tells you that all of these light-skinned black people are descended from sexual assault from slavery days and Jim Crow days and stuff. And while I'm sure that many of them have that mixed heritage, that mixed bloodline because of relationships like Morgan Freeman's great-great-great-grandparents. So Mr. Alfred and Miss Celie, they had it going on like a chicken bone. And then after emancipation, you know what? They stayed together. They left the plantation. I think they had something like 7 or 8 kids. 4 of them were sons. They couldn't be legally married. So since illegitimate children born out of wedlock couldn't inherit their father's land legally, Mr. Alfred, before he died, went down and transferred the family land over into the name of his 4 sons. And you can go to Kosciuszko, Mississippi, to the Carr land, and you can see the headstones of Alfred and Celie, where they lived together in life and they lived together in death, side by side. But they met because Mr. Alfred was essentially a sharecropper on the same plantation, the Johnson's plantation, where Miss Celie lived. So this idea that it was white men on horses riding around trying to control the black man, or the black folks, as Dr. Dunn says, white men on horses have always been a problem for the black folks. What about them white folks that wasn't in the photograph that was still picking that cotton? Did that man, I don't even know that he was an overseer per se at that time. He was probably just a supervisor, foreman. I've worked industrial jobs where I'd be down in the shop fabbing up stuff, and there'd be a row of windows up by the ceiling of this shop, and that's where the management's office was. And they're looking out through those windows, looking down there at all us little fitters down there in the shop to make sure we didn't have cell phones back then, to make sure we ain't down there sitting down or wasting time, drinking coffee or shooting a bull. That's the modern version of what Dr. Dunn calls white men on horses. The dude was probably just some sort of a job foreman. Not like a slavery overseer, but that's how Dr. Dunn presents it to you. See, so that picture he gave and that story he told, that narrative, dare I say, that he's putting out to you, nope, got more holes in it than Swiss cheese. And this is why education matters. And I'm Dane.